Who would have thought that Evander Alistair, the so-called Archimage, would die not on the battlefield, but from a curse? More than a dozen students surrounded Evander on his deathbed, their eyes filled with tears. "Master, you promised that as soon as I become a mage in the royal court, you would tell me the secret of the history of the void," said the young girl in the white robe. "You cannot die. You promised." Evander smiled and stroked her hair. She was the youngest of all his students and the brightest. 5 years ago he was traveling through the endless wilderness to the west. Along the way he passed a village devastated by a land dragon. Though these creatures were weak in Evander's opinion, they still possessed enough power to wipe out a village or two. The desert clans were unable to overpower the land dragon, resulting in hundreds of victims. This girl was among those who survived. After he killed the land dragon, the girl followed him. It would have been easy for Evander to shake off the tail, but curiosity took over. After 3 days of stalking, he finally turned and faced the girl. "Why are you following me?" he asked. "How did you do that?" she asked. It had been 3 days since she'd followed Evander across the desert, and he'd never seen her eat. Moreover, the leather flask of water she carried with her had long since emptied. The girl seemed to follow him because of her will. "Did what?" "I saw you kill a desert beast. Dragon. Please," she knelt before him. "Teach me." Others might say it was silly, but for Evander it was one of the dearest memories of his short life. Meeting this fragile girl gave him a sense of purpose. He used to kill monsters left and right just to satisfy his curiosity and relieve his boredom. But after that moment, he decided to take on disciples, raising them to lead the next generation. Now the very same disciples surrounded him, uttering words one after another, telling him that he must be strong, and begging him to resist the curse. Unfortunately, this curse did not come from some monster, but from a failed experiment. In his youth, Evander sought the elixir of immortality. He was looking for a way to transfer souls, a way to prolong the life of a mortal. After countless experiments, he obtained a similar result. Instead of prolonging his life, the curse was eating away at his soul. And now, when he was only 50 years old, he was slowly dying. Thinking back to his youth, Evander realized that he had done a foolish thing. Decades passed after his countless experiments before he realized the true beauty of life. Life without end was not beautiful, it was nothing short of torture. If Evander could go back in time and meet his young self, he would tell him that what he was striving for was foolishness, a futile occupation that would bring nothing but an endless cycle of agony and misery. "Teacher, please don't leave us. Teacher, Lord Evander." Under the incessant sobbing, Evander felt his strength leave his body. He could no longer open his mouth to speak. His fingers began to turn to ashes. His complete disappearance was only a matter of time. Using what was left of his magic, he spoke through everyone's mind. "I regret that I can no longer accompany each of you on the journey ahead. The war with the demons will certainly be hard, but I have faith in each of you." "Liane," Evander addressed the girl. "After I die, take my research from the Forbidden Tower. Inside these books I have written the secret of the history of the void. The Forbidden Tower will respond to your magic." The young girl nodded, but her nose was still running snotty. By this time all that was left of Evander was his torso and head. "Everything else has turned to dust." "Pillars," said Evander. The oldest of his students, an old bald man, answered, "Teacher, I trust the students to you." Pillars bit his lip, tears rolling down his cheeks. "Yes, teacher." Evander closed his eyes. Moments later, his body turned to dust. Evander never believed in an afterlife. To him, the gods were an aggregation of magic, nothing more. But now he was beginning to doubt his faith. After all, he should be dead, but for some reason he still felt sensations all over his body. He felt pain in his chest and knees. He could taste the blood in his mouth. He could smell burning flesh. "What's going on?" Evander heard voices. "You goddamn incompetent bastard," shouted someone. "I told you to teach him a lesson. Not kill him." There was a pounding of the fist that struck the flesh. The smell of vomit was in the air. "But, boss, that damn nobleman is too arrogant. He even spit in my face when I talked to him." "So what?" Evander heard the rumble of flying and shattering wooden crates. "Tell me, how are we going to get a ransom with a dead body? Tell me." The speaker was full of such furious rage that Evander could feel the rage piercing his flesh. Hearing this, Evander tried to put the pieces of the puzzle together. "And maybe we can still revive him. Let's try asking some magician at. There is no magic that can bring a dead man back to life. Damn it, damn it." A moment of silence followed. Only heavy breathing could be heard. Evander tried to open his eyes, but the cloth wrapped around his head prevented him. "Boss, what do we do?" "Burn the body. We can't leave any evidence. After that, burn this cursed place, too." "But what about redemption?" Didn't you hear what I told you? How can we ransom a dead man? If you understand, go and burn it. Evander felt multiple hands untie him. His eyes were still blindfolded, but the ropes tied around his legs had been cut. Evander was confused by what was happening. He was sure he had died on his bed, but now he found that he had been tied up and gagged by unknown men. Wait, boss. The men carrying him froze. Slowly, they lowered his bound body to the ground. He's still alive. Did you feel it too? He's got a pulse. After this statement, Evander heard the sound of someone running. He felt someone palpating his neck to check his pulse. There was a jubilant shout. That damn bastard's alive. He's alive, shouted the boss. Hurry up. Water. The rag stuffed into Evander's mouth was removed along with the bandage. Without warning, cold water was splashed in his face. He blinked 3 times, then spat out the blood lodged in his mouth. It took some time for his eyes to adjust to the darkness. As he looked around, he realized he was in a small cell. 2 small torches were pinned to the walls, and wooden crates were piled on top of each other. There were 5 grown men standing around him. The one in the center breathed a sigh of relief. He stared at the blinking Evander, then grinned. Little puppy, so you're still alive, he said. He didn't hide the chuckle in his voice. You made us worry for nothing. From his voice, this man was probably what they called the boss. Evander at first imagined him to be a large, bulky man. But contrary to his expectations, he was a thin guy with a long, unshaven chin. His skin was covered with numerous tattoos. 2 large metal rings pierced his nose. Still stunned by what was happening, Evander was silent. Talk already, growled the boss. His fist struck Evander in the face, causing a tooth to fly out of his mouth. The taste of blood was becoming more and more familiar. Coughing, Evander spoke. Where am I? What's going on? I don't understand. Numerous questions filled his mind. Out of his confusion, he was almost oblivious to the pain that was coursing through his body. The men around him looked at each other. Finally one of them replied, pretending you don't remember. He spat in Evander's face. Listen, if your father doesn't bring us the money soon, we'll start cutting off your limbs one by one. The confusion inside Evander intensified. Father? The money? A lot of it didn't make any sense. Now he needed to get rid of his wounds. Even though he was used to the pain, having experienced it on the battlefield, it was still an unpleasant sensation. The floor is freaking cold, Evander muttered. To the surprise of the men, the ropes binding his hands burned away and turned to dust. Evander slowly stood up, shook the dust off his clothes, then channeled mana through his body. The wounds on his skin were slowly healing. The 5 men took a few steps back. They had seen magic many times before, but not like this. It was impossible to heal all these wounds in a few seconds. Evander looked around. The door to the cell was locked with a metal chain. I have some questions. I hope you can answer them for me, Evander said. He frowned. He knew it wasn't his body. He had never been so small and skinny. The clothes he wore were too gaudy, with ruffles on his neck and sleeves instead of a simple robe. Who are you? Sighed the boss. He shifted his gaze to Evander for a moment and felt a chill run down his spine. The previously fear-filled eyes of this young nobleman had become predatory. Such were the eyes of one who had already taken many lives. Wiping the blood clinging to the corners of his lips, Evander replied, Who am I? That's what I'm trying to find out. Evander snapped his finger and 5 spheres of light appeared above his head, illuminating the room with an azure glow. A small mirror made of water magic appeared in front of him. Evander stared at the figure reflected in it. Short silver hair, blue eyes, ivory skin. Though his clothes were tattered into rags, they seemed colorful, with golden patterns embroidered on his chest. The ruffles at the hem reminded Evander of one of Leanne's dresses. Young man? His mind was full of thoughts and questions. He was sure he was dead. Evander's mortal body, which had resisted the curse only through magical power, had finally crumbled and turned to dust. There was no doubt about it. A growl brought Evander out of his stupor. Who are you? It can't be that the inept son of the Marcus family is capable of silent magic. The boss drew his sword. His men did the same. The sound of the scabbard echoed through the chamber. Get him? On cue, the 4 men sprinted toward him. As Evander felt his body, he realized that the mana reserve in his current shell was low. The magic he had just used had used up almost half of his mana. Compared to his former body, the magical abilities of this new body were like a drop in a lake. I still have some questions I'd like to ask, Evander said. But the leader should be more than enough. Evander snapped his fingers, and the spheres of light disappeared, the flames on the torches scattered, and the room was plunged into darkness. In the darkness, he struck his attackers one by one. The boss could see nothing, but he trembled as he realized that his men had been knocked out. The boss felt someone's hand grab him by the neck. At that moment all his strength left his body. He could not move. He wanted to scream, but he didn't make a sound. "It would be a waste of time to question you," said a voice from the darkness. "I'll just read your memories." Read memories? Such magic did not exist. What the young nobleman had just said was absurd, but the boss's instinct screamed otherwise. "Now it's time for bed." Hearing these words, the boss lost consciousness. Evander Alistair could not recover from the shock. After reading the relevant recollections of the group leader, he learned that the current body he possessed belonged to a young nobleman from the house of Marcus. This young nobleman was well known for his hedonistic lifestyle. A vain, jealous young man who sexually harassed every beautiful woman he met along the way. Memories read through magic are usually fragmentary and incomplete. Evander was surprised that, despite the limitations of this spell, he was able to see so much information about the notoriety of his current shell. It seems that the previous owner of his body was hated by everyone. A nobleman who used his family's name as he pleased, without looking back. Most likely, the true owner died in the hands of these guys, and for some unknown reason, Evander's soul took over this body. Such a phenomenon he had in no way expected. After all, Evander did not believe in an afterlife, and for the same reason he kept searching for the elixir of immortality when he was young. Who would have thought that there really is life after death? Reincarnation. Evander grinned. "Funny," he said. "So this is Lucas's kingdom, huh?" He could not remember a kingdom with that name. Was it the same world, but on a different continent? A different timeline? Or maybe a different world altogether? He shuddered with joy and smiled. His current shell was young, probably 14 or 15 years old. He would have plenty of time to explore this new environment. Evander was sitting on a wooden crate. Beside him on the ground lay the bodies of 5 unconscious men. It was dark, but his eyes had adjusted. He summoned a pebble-sized sphere of light in the palm of his hand. "Just as I thought," Evander sighed. His current body's magical abilities were low, almost non-existent, just like a normal person's. The sequence of simple magic spells he'd already cast had used up almost all of his mana. If he is going to explore the mysteries of this world, he will need a more powerful vessel. Evander decided that to achieve his goal he would first train this body. He heard footsteps outside. By the sound, Evander determined that more than 24 people were approaching. He dispersed the sphere of light in his palm, and the darkness filled the room again. Using what was left of his magic, he heightened his senses. Soon he heard muffled voices outside. "He's still alive, isn't he? Of course. He must. Lord Dracus would kill us if he knew his son was dead. Be ready to attack on my signal." Evander realized that these people must be the same mags the attackers were talking about. They must be here to save him. Evander couldn't help laughing. He got up from his seat, then lay on the ground, pretending to be unconscious. He didn't understand why he was given a second chance at life, but he might as well take it. For now, he decided to see where this would lead. Bam! There was the sound of a door smashing to pieces. Slivers flew in all directions, and the metal lock fell to the floor with a clang. With his eyes closed, Evander felt many people enter the room. All of them stopped at once. What the hell? Who did this? There was silence for a moment. They seemed surprised to find their enemies already unconscious. "The young master is here. This way." Evander felt 2 large hands lifting him up. His eyes remained closed as he waited for developments. He couldn't help but smirk in anticipation. He had to admit, this was exciting. How is the young master doing? He seems fine. No damage, as far as I can see. Damn. Evander almost bit his lip. He'd forgotten that he'd healed his entire body. It would have been suspicious if he hadn't had a single scratch on him. He chastised himself for not thinking of such an obvious thing. Thank God. Lord Dracus would kill us if anything happened to his son. Evander sensed the sincere relief in the speaker's voice. He felt someone slap him lightly. This is it. I can finally play the part. Slowly, Evander opened his eyes. He blinked, then looked around. Young master. Around him were relieved faces of men and women. Unlike the previous guys, this group wore azure cloaks. They had a rose and shield emblem on their chests. Evander pretended to feel dizzy and sat up slowly. What's wrong? Evander asked. Young sir, I'm so glad you're safe, said an older man with a monocle. He was wearing a brown vest and a bow tie. His ashy hair was neatly slicked back. We've been looking for you for days. He pretended to know the old man. You've come at last. I've been here so long. He looked at the unconscious men lying on the floor. He opened his eyes wide, trying to look surprised. They are unconscious, said the old man, his eyebrows furrowed and his eyes grim. "Young master, what happened here?" There was silence. Evander shook his head. "I don't know." The cloaked figures looked at each other. The old man frowned. "But, young master." "Stop it," Evander put a hand to his forehead. "I'm getting dizzy. Take me back home." The old man closed his eyes and after a moment bowed his head. "Of course. You must be tired. As you wish." He turned to the cloaked figures. "Escort the young gentleman to the carriage. Ask the physician to examine his body." 5 cloaked figures helped Evander up. After Evander left the cell, his senses intensified again. He heard what was said inside the room. "Sir Gaston, what do we do with these people?" "I talked to the Silver Hand. They are independent little pipsqueaks," the old man said. There was no sympathy in his voice. "Make them talk. All of them. The method doesn't matter. Make them talk. After that you can kill them." "Accepted. Lark Marcus," he muttered. Evander liked the sound of his new name. At least his parents had good taste. Lark sat in the carriage, heading for his mansion. Through the window he could see the small town. Earthen houses were haphazardly built in all directions. The streets were covered with snow, creating a white backdrop. In the magical empire, this place could hardly be called a city. It would have been more accurate to call it a village. By his count, there weren't more than 100 houses here. Still peeking out the window, he saw the residents shivering in the streets. They were skin and bones, as if they hadn't eaten in days. "Why do you let the residents starve to death in this weather?" Lark asked. Gaston, who was sitting next to him, was surprised by this question. He had known the young master since he was a boy, and he knew that he did not care for the residents in the slightest. The old butler cleared his throat. "Young master, don't you remember the Black Famine?" Under the stare of the butler, Lark replied, "I don't really bother to remember the little things." "Well," Gaston sighed, 3 months ago a black famine broke out in the kingdom, right before the harvest. As a result, all the crops withered away. Only the root crops were left. Now wheat is worth its weight in gold. The nobles themselves can barely make ends meet. We can't afford to feed these people." Gaston explained that the black famine was caused by the numerous small insects that devoured the crops. Although they did not stay for long, their bites caused the crops to die and wither within days. These insects had plagued the kingdom for so long that the king instructed the Ministry of Research to find a way to eliminate the pests. From the description, these insects were probably Kelnup's flies. Lark had encountered them in his past life, and, based on his knowledge, dealing with these pests will be easy. If these are indeed Kelnup flies, then the plants, they are the same. The likelihood that this was the same world he had recently left was high, but right now he didn't have enough proof. If possible, he would like to go to the library and learn more about this world, but that would have to wait for now. First he had to deal with the immediate issues at hand. Lark frowned his eyebrows. "But I don't understand. There's so much food growing on the land here. There's no reason for the inhabitants to starve to death, is there?" Gaston also looked out the window. "What do you mean, young master?" Lark pointed to the weeds growing on the snow-covered ground, and there were quite a few of them. "They are edible," said Lark. Gaston looked at him with eyes full of understanding. "Young master, they are poisonous. If you eat them raw." "Yes," said Lark. He shouted to the coachman, "Stop the carriage." The carriage stopped. Lark opened the door, and the icy snow fell on him. Gaston quickly followed him. "Young master, you will catch cold. Please return to the carriage." Lark ignored the old butler. He bent down and pulled a handful of weeds from the ground. "What do you call them here?" Lark asked. Butler, though doubtful, replied, "A poisonous cloud. They help melt the snow in winter, so the inhabitants don't pull them out." "But, young master, as I said before, it has been proven that they are poisonous." Lark smiled. "Have you heard of commoner's wheat before?" There was a brief pause before Gaston shook his head. He wanted to drag the young gentleman off this frosty street. "Tell the other servants to pick as much poison cloud as they can and put it in the carts," Lark said. Seeing that Gaston was about to object, he added, "That's an order." The old man only sighed and bowed. "As you wish, young master." Soon the servants from neighboring carriages came out one by one. Dressed only in tunics and wooden sandals, they were shivering with cold. After receiving instructions from the butler, they began to pull the weeds and put them into the carts. "Gaston, how many residents are there in this town?" Lark asked. "About 500, young master." As expected, the place was almost deserted. With such a paltry population, it couldn't even be called a city. After learning the population of his territory, Lark told the servants to gather enough grass to fill 2 carts. Some of the residents walking through the snow stopped and watched as they pulled the weeds from the ground. Gaston couldn't help but shake his head. He knew they were wasting their time, but he had no choice, for it was the young master's order. That should be enough, Lark said, then clapped his hands. Here we go. After filling 2 carts with weeds, the group continued onto the mansion located in the center of town. According to Gaston, a wealthy merchant from another country lived here before Marcus's house got the property. The interior of the mansion was good enough for Lark to give it a passing grade. After changing, Lark asked Gaston to call the servants. Soon 11 men and women gathered in the hall. Listen, said Lark, holding the poison cloud in his hand. As lord of this territory, I do not want my subjects to starve to death. The servants were embarrassed, but remained silent. We will distribute food to all the residents. After that, we will teach them how to get their own food during this frosty winter. One of the servants timidly asked, but, young master, the supplies in the granary are almost empty. We may even have to import some wheat for the rest of the winter. Forgive me for saying this, but it will be impossible to feed all the inhabitants. We have a solution for that, Lark said confidently. He raised his hand with a blade of grass, showing poison cloud. We've assembled 2 carts full of it. You call it poison cloud, don't you? The servants were puzzled. Young master, they are poisonous. The inhabitants will die if we feed them. Lark found it amusing. In his past life, this plant was highly prized. Weeds were easy to grow, requiring neither sun nor water to grow. The only drawback was that they were not as tasty as wheat. However, for a starving man, the taste of the food was a trifle. Silence, said Lark. Everyone was immediately silent. These weeds are not poisonous if you cook them properly. First you burn them until they turn to dust. Collect all the leftovers and boil them. Understand? The servants hesitated. After Lark's fierce stare, they all bowed their heads. Yes, young master. Lark clapped his hands together. Remember the instructions. Now get to work. The servants dispersed and set to work. Under Lark's direction, they cleared the hearth and used it to burn the weeds. After turning them to chaff and dust, they collected the remains and boiled them in water. To their surprise, the little black particles turned pale brown and swelled. They resembled a grit. Gaston was speechless. He looked at the young gentleman and noticed that he was smirking. It's, Gaston's voice broke off. Commoner's wheat, said Lark. It is unpalatable, but edible. When burned, the poison in the weed is broken down by the heat. It tastes a little nasty, but it'll do for now. I see, said Gaston. But, young master, are you sure it's safe for consumption? If the inhabitants die because of it, your father, it's perfectly safe, Lark said. He scooped up a grain and put it in his mouth. Gaston's jaw dropped when he saw the young master eating what he always thought was poisonous. See, after another minute, Gaston was convinced of this. The young master had eaten the poison cloud, but he was perfectly fine. The burning process must have really destroyed the poison. Spread the news to the residents. The mansion will be giving away free food to everyone who wants it. Gaston sensed that something had changed in the young master. His arrogant, unpleasant demeanor disappeared. Instead, the butler saw a different light in his eyes. The old man could not determine what exactly it was, but he could not help but tremble with excitement. After all, this was the first time the young master had shown compassion for the common people. Gaston bowed. As you wish. The news of the free porridge provided by the young gentleman stirred up the people of Blackstone Township. According to the servants he sent, the nobleman from the Marcus family was going to distribute the free food to all the people of the town. All they had to do was to come to the mansion and receive the food in person. When Lo Yuer heard this, he rejected the news. This young lord was arrogant and condescending, even worse than the merchants who occasionally passed through town. 3 months ago, when a black famine had struck the kingdom, Lo Yuer had gone to the mansion to beg for food. He was willing to take scraps, anything, since his younger brother was starving. Lo Yuer would have understood if the young lord had been unable to allocate food to them, for the black famine affected everyone, regardless of status. But instead of simply rejecting his pleas for help, Lo Avar was beaten by the noble lord's guards. Had it not been for the butler, Lo Avar would have died. His hatred grew ever since. He knew there could be no free food in the mansion. It was out of the question that an incarnation of the devil would care for ordinary people like them. Fortunately for Lo Avar, his younger brother survived that famine. Although now they were both skin and bones from constant hunger, at least they were still alive. During the freezing winter they stripped the bark from the trees and ate it. If the gods were favorable, they could eat a frog or a mouse for supper. Antony, said Lo Yuer. He picked up his wooden bow and quiver. I'm going to try to hunt for food. Don't go outside. Understand? It was cold, and the chances of successfully hunting a rabbit or other small animals in the nearby forest were close to zero, but Lo Yuer wanted to try anyway. He had to find a way to get food for the two of them, or they would die this winter. Antony, Lo Yuer said. There was no reply. He pushed aside the tattered cloth that served as a partition between the bed and the kitchen. His supposedly still sleeping brother was gone. Lo Yuer furrowed his brow. Where did that child go? Hurriedly pulling on his tattered cloak, he went outside. Snow was falling from the sky, covering roofs and streets. With every breath he took, steam gushed out of his mouth. Usually there were very few people outside in this weather. Even homeless people would try to find shelter from this cold. But now there were a lot of people on the street. What's going on? He approached the dressmaker. After he grabbed her shoulder, the old woman turned around. Lo Yuer. What is it? Since it was a small town, everyone knew almost everyone by name. Why are there so many people outside? It was literally freezing cold. Haven't you heard about the free wheat gruel from the young gentleman? The old dressmaker asked, raising an eyebrow. You mean that lousy news about the noble from Marcus family? Lo Yuer said grimly. He didn't believe the news for a second. The dressmaker looked around nervously. Sure. What if someone from the mansion hears you? So what? Lo Yuer said. They are going to kill me, aren't they? These guys are demons. Granny, you mustn't trust them. It would be better for you to stay inside. You'll only catch cold here. There's no way those arrogant bastards will open the warehouse to us common people. Although the dressmaker heard his warning, she did not seem to have the slightest intention of returning. Lo Yuer sighed. He saw more and more people leaving their homes, probably heading for the mansion. By the way, have you seen Antony? Lo Yuer asked. The tailor tightened the thin scarf around her neck. I saw him some time ago when he passed my shop. Perhaps he's on his way to the mansion. Lo Yuer sighed heavily. The child probably didn't tell him because he knew he would refuse. I see, said Lo Yuer. Thank you. Lo Yuer, along with the other inhabitants, went to the mansion. When he got there, he saw the joyful faces of the people. Some of them were holding large bowls of food, sipping it excitedly. For a moment Lo Yuer was stunned to discover that the news was indeed true. So the young master was really trying to feed the starving inhabitants. Lo Yuer could not believe it. Under normal circumstances, when the vault was full, it would have been a miracle for the nobles to feed the common people. But now, with the kingdom in famine, it was even more absurd. How did they get enough food to feed all these people? Don't tell me the young gentleman used his own pocket money to import food from Lion City? Impossible. The devil is not that generous. Listen up. As soon as you're done with your food, put the bowls back so others can use them, shouted the young man with the silver hair. Lo Yuer stared at him in surprise. There was no doubt it was the second son of Lord Drucus. The servants filled the bowls to the brim, then handed them to the people in line. The line was long, but Lo Yuer was sure it didn't matter to the starving inhabitants how long they had to wait. They were just thankful that they had a chance to eat at all. Antony! Shouted Lo Yuer. At last he saw his little brother at the top of the line. As he was about to approach, the servants stopped him. The butler of the Marcus family shook his head. No skips in line. Go to the back. Lo Yuer waited helplessly for his younger brother. After getting his portion of food, the young lord left a charcoal mark on the back of the boy's hand. Why did you leave without telling me? Reprimanded Lo Yuer as soon as his brother approached him. He was carrying a large bowl filled with porridge. You hate the young master, don't you? If I told you, you wouldn't let me come, Antony replied. He spoke loudly. Hearing this, the young master stared at Lo Yuer. When Lo Yuer saw this, he panicked and silenced his younger brother. Sure. Not so loud. Lo Yuer sighed. He couldn't help but stare at the bowl full of food his little brother was holding. Big brother, you should get a bowl, too, Antony said. He scooped from the bottom and showed Lo Yuer the contents. Look, they put a lot of wheat in there. Lo Yuer swallowed his saliva. His stomach rumbled. It would be an hour or two before he got in line, but the temptation to eat was too enticing. One bowl would probably be enough for the whole day. Listen up. The young gentleman clapped his hands. Despite the falling snow, he stood outside the manor as if he wasn't afraid of catching a cold. I want you to spread the news. Every day, until the next harvest, we will give each resident 2 bowls of wheat gruel, one in the morning and one in the evening. This statement roused everyone. Murmurs filled the grounds of the mansion. Is this true, young master? Asked one of the residents. The young gentleman nodded and smiled confidently. Of course. Lark Marcus, never lie. You have my word. Although Lo Yuer doubted the veracity of the promise, he rejoiced. The news of the free food today was, after all, true. But it's not free, declared the young gentleman. The people of the town panicked. This town was one of the poorest in the region. If the young lord began to demand silver for food, they would not have the means to pay. For every bowl of porridge, a man must pay with 3 poison clouds, said the young master. He pulled a blade of grass from his pocket and showed it to everyone. To get your share of the food, you must give 3 of these. That's the rule. That's it. One of the residents asked, If it's just a poison cloud, I have a lot of them growing around my house. Me too. The crowd began to get excited. It seemed to Lo Yue that the fee was too cheap. After all, you could get poison clouds just by walking the streets. The young gentleman grinned. I declare that henceforth under my rule no one will go hungry during the freezing winter. This is the promise of Lark Marcus. In the days that followed, the town of Blackston became lively. Despite the falling snow, people could often be seen near houses picking poisonous weeds on the ground. Since these plants were ubiquitous, fights over them were rare. As Lark looked out the window of his room, he felt a sense of satisfaction. After learning that he was the lord of the territory, the first thing he decided to do was to restore order to the city. And to do that, the first thing he had to do was to satisfy the hunger of his men. After all, hungry people were no different than mindless beasts. It would have been unwise to entrust important work to such people. Someone knocked, and the door creaked open. Gaston came in and handed him a stack of papers. Young gentleman, these are the documents and records for the town of Blackston. He looked at the young nobleman inquiringly. He had no idea that the time would come when the young lord would become interested in how to run the city. And to his utter amazement, the young lord asked him to gather all the available documents concerning the city. The stack of papers was as thick as my forearm. Normally, it would take a scholar a week to absorb what was written there. However, the young gentleman simply glanced at each page. His eyes ran quickly over each document, quickly reading them with magic. An hour later, Lark threw the last document on the table. He nodded to himself and rested a hand on his chin. Then he took out a quill pen and drew a complex symbol on the blank parchment. Now I have a clear idea of the state of the city, said Lark. Gaston, I want you to order the mason who lives in the city to make 100 stone plaques for me. He held out a parchment to the old butler. Tell him to carve these symbols into them. As for size, half a hand's length in both height and width will suffice. Make them as thick as your finger. The butler was puzzled. Young master, a stone plaque of this size would cost us 2 or 3 silver coins each. I don't think it's wise to spend on unnecessary things. It's not unnecessary, said Lark. He sat down in a chair and sipped some wine. These things will allow my subjects at least to survive the winter. Young master, I don't understand, said Gaston. You don't need to understand, Lark said bluntly. Just do it. Gaston furrowed his brow. I obey. When the old butler left the room, Lark stood up and took a document from the stack of papers. Inside was written the number of houses and families in the town of Blackston. Got her handed to the merchant who used to live here, Lark said. The document was about a year old, but it would be enough for a start. He made my job a lot easier. He even made a census of the families living here. Lark still didn't know why the second son of the powerful Marcus family had been sent to this decrepit town, but since this place was granted territory, he might as well nurture it. His current body was still young, and despite his very low mana supply, he still had plenty of room to grow. It might be a few more years before he could create large-scale magic like he used to. 3 days later, the stone tablets were finally finished. To call them stone tablets was somewhat of an exaggeration. They looked more like dirt than stone. Their brown surface reminded Lark of the uneven ground on the outskirts of the magical empire. Lark summoned the servants to the hall. In front of everyone, he announced, I want these plaques strategically placed between the houses. As for using them, said Lark. He pulled out a pouch filled with golden sand. Basically, they are heat stones. They will adjust their temperature accordingly, maintaining an optimal temperature within a limited radius. Since the city is small, 100 stones will suffice. Gaston stared at the golden sand the young master held in his hand. If he was not mistaken, it was gold dust, the raw material often used to create gold threads. The young gentleman, of course, would not. Before Gaston could react, Lark sprinkled gold dust on the symbols carved on the stone tablets. Then he placed his palm on the center of the symbol. Soon the hexagram glowed gold, and a moment later it disappeared. After Lark proceeded to the third plaque, Gaston was finally able to protest. Young master, this is gold dust. To use it like this, Gaston shrieked. He shuddered as he saw the gold dust disappear before his eyes. It was like throwing away gold coins. Lark laughed. Relax. What good is gold thread? It won't increase the productivity of my men. With these hestones, winter work won't be a problem anymore. As time passed, Gaston realized that the young master was becoming more and more eccentric. Where had the hedonistic, mischievous, and arrogant young master gone? As old as he was, Gaston saw that the young master had changed. Soon all the signs were finished. Lark nodded, satisfied with his work. Gaston noticed that the temperature in the manor had changed. It was as if summer had arrived. Nice and warm, isn't it? Lark grinned. The advantage of gold dust is that even after a long time, the magic doesn't disappear. That's why gold dust is one of the catalysts for the application of large-scale magic. If it were high-ranking magic, the effect wouldn't last long with such bad materials. Lark told Butler, the heat stones will melt the snow within a certain radius. Place them about 30 meters apart. To be sure, bury them half a meter into the ground. Also issue a decree that anyone who destroys or steals them will be severely punished. Seeing his determined expression, Gaston nodded. As you wish, young master. I'll have the servants set them up all over the city. Lark smiled. According to the papers, about 60 or 70 residents are now homeless. Spread the news that Lark of the Marcus family is willing to give them free food and shelter in exchange for their work. Gaston was astonished. But, young master, this is absurd. We cannot maintain such a large number of servants. After reading the documents, Lark learned that he had about 400 gold coins left in his coffers. It was probably a small amount compared to other nobles, but in this small town it would be enough to hire a large number of people. Lark decided it was better to let the money circulate than to leave it in the treasury. After all, as lord of this city, it would all eventually come back to him in taxes. His most important asset now was not the gold coins, but the people. In this city, with not even 1,000 inhabitants, it would be foolish to let them die of hunger and cold. He saw the barren lands he passed through as he rode in the carriage. According to Gaston, these lands were barren. Lark shook his head as he learned that the vast lands around the city were underutilized. According to the farmers, only a small part of it was suitable for growing wheat. But Lark knew that this was nonsense born of ignorance. Lark was sure that these so-called unplowed lands could be turned into abundant wheat fields. It would take time, but it would increase the prosperity of his territory. And right now, these unemployed and homeless residents were perfect candidates for the job. In his room, Lark sat cross-legged on the floor. Ever since he received his new body, he had never once neglected to train his manner. Although his current vessel was very weak, he knew that with proper training he could become strong enough to create large-scale magic. Closing his eyes, he began to move a small amount of mana through his body. He directed it through different parts of his body, making it circulate constantly. Only through this procedure did his body become accustomed to the existence of mana. This simple and repetitive exercise would help him increase his mana supply. His breathing slowed and the sounds around him disappeared. He could no longer hear the blizzard outside the window. He could no longer hear his own quiet breathing. He could no longer feel the carpet beneath him. All he was aware of were the snake-like currents of energy in his body, chaotically moving mana. Minutes turned into hours. By the time Lark was finished, his body, despite the cold weather, was wet with sweat. His heart was pounding loudly and his temples were throbbing. Lark exhaled and stood up. A smile slowly appeared on his face. It's pretty fun. The sensation of slowly expanding mana was something he had long forgotten. In his last life, his body had reached such an enormous mana reserve that it was no longer possible to expand it further. Just as he was about to eat, there was a knock on the door 3 times, and Gaston's voice rang out. Young gentlemen, residents who responded to the job offer gathered in the hall. That was quick. Lark said, "Good job." Leaving his room, Lark headed into the hall with the old butler. The guards and servants greeted him. The inhabitants, on the other hand, looked nervous. Some were looking at paintings and furniture, others were staring at the floor, apparently afraid of the guards. "Welcome," said Lark. "I'm sure you already know me, but let me introduce myself. I am the Lord of Blackstone Town, Lark Marcus." The residents bowed their heads. Lark quickly counted the number of candidates. 48. It was less than he expected. "I'll get right to the point," Lark said. "I'm here to offer everyone a job. A job that will feed you. Everyone will be well compensated." There was a short pause. "How many of you can read and write?" The commoners looked at each other. As expected, there were none. Lark just smiled. He hadn't expected them to. After all, they should have gotten at least a basic education. As he was about to continue his speech, to his surprise, a young woman raised her hand. I can read and write," she said. Her blonde hair was frizzy and her face was covered with dirt. Her dress was moth-eaten. When she noticed that everyone was looking at her, she hunched her shoulders to make herself look smaller. Lark said. His eyes glittered with interest. "Would you mind telling me how you learn it?" A few seconds of hesitation followed. "Once worked for a nobleman in the city of Leo. At that time the mistress allowed me to study with her. Through this I learned to read and write." Lark sensed that she was not lying. He shifted his gaze to Gaston for a moment, and the old butler seemed to understand his intention. He pulled the young woman out of the crowd and let her stay beside the young master. "Name?" Lark asked. "M. Melody, young master," she replied. He saw her shoulders trembling. Lark was aware of his vessel's transgressions. Sexual harassment, physical abuse, attempted murder. The previous owner of this body, despite his youth, was a real demon. He could understand why she was afraid of a man like him. For now, all he could do was slowly change the perception of his charges over time. "If you pass my little test, I'll give you an important position later," Lark said in a low voice so only she could hear. The young woman looked at him bewildered, but then nodded. Lark cleared his throat. "Can anyone else read or write?" No one else raised their hand. "Right now I need 3 kinds of people: farmers, construction workers, and soldiers," Lark said. "In a month, winter will be over. It will be at least 2 weeks before the snow melts completely. Once that happens, I want my farmers to start cultivating the land to the north and west right away." Lark noticed that some of them looked at him with bewilderment. "But, young lord," said one of the commoners, "the northern and western lands of Blackstone are dead. It is impossible to grow crops there." "We have a solution to this problem," Lark said. After reading the documents left behind by a wealthy merchant, he learned that there was a certain area of the city where the inhabitants dumped their nightly gold. This practice had been going on for more than 10 years, a fact that pleased Lark greatly. As soon as winter was over, he would commission several farmers to scatter the natural compost on the north and west lands. Of course, there was always a risk of disease when using human waste, but Lark planned to deal with it secretly through magic. For now, all he had to do was wait until winter was over to start tilling the land. Lark clapped his hands. "The builders will be next. It doesn't matter if you're male or female. Under my supervision, you will build houses in the eastern part of Blackstone. Over the course of this year, I plan to expand the boundaries of the town at least twice as much. The pay will be 6 silver coins per month. The houses built will be made available to those who do not have homes in Blackstone. Of course, it will not be free. You will be required to pay a monthly rent of 2 silver coins and 25 coppers. Construction will begin now." In this way, the number of homeless locals would be reduced, and at the same time Lark could distribute his money efficiently through wages and rent. Since the residents would later have to pay taxes anyway, it was a win-win situation. The commoners were clearly interested in this offer. After all, the usual monthly income of a Blackstone resident was about 3 pieces of silver. The wages offered were twice that. Even if they paid rent, they would have more than enough money left over for food and other necessities. Moreover, they would have their own house to live in. But there was one problem. "But, young master," said one of them, "you said you were planning to start construction this winter. There's snow on the street up to our calves. We'll freeze to death if we work in this weather." That was one of the reasons why Lark immediately created the Hestones after receiving the city's documents. He couldn't wait until winter was over before he could start building. Waiting a month and a half just because of the stupid snow would have been a waste of time. "I've had some servants set up some Hestones near the eastern edge of town," Lark said. "This will melt the snow and lessen the cold considerably. In addition, we will provide the workers with warm clothing and hot soup to combat the cold. Rest assured no one will die from the cold during construction." The commoners were perplexed as to what Hestones were, but nodded. Since with the cultivation of the land will have to wait until the snow melts, farmers will temporarily help builders during the winter. The payment will be the same, 6 pieces of silver. Farmers, builders, and soldiers have the right to get a house. They only have to pay the appropriate rent. And finally, soldiers, said Lark. Of the 48 assembled, only 23 were men. Lark secretly hoped that many of them would join his army. Only men can become soldiers. The soldiers will be paid 11 pieces of silver and 3 meals a day, and once every 4 days a small piece of meat. In addition, I will allow them to stay in a hut behind the mansion. It should be spacious enough to accommodate everyone. This announcement stirred up the crowd. Judging by their expressions, they happily accepted the offer. 11 pieces of silver was an absurd wage for commoners like them. Moreover, after accepting the offer, they would have a house. Even the old butler looked shocked by the young lord's sudden announcement. Lark merely grinned and told him to be silent without a word. "In addition to Melody's responsibility, I have clearly defined the terms of employment for everyone," Lark said. "I'll give each of you half an hour to decide what profession you'd like to choose. Of course, if you don't want to work for me, that's okay, too." Half an hour later, Gaston gave Lark the results. 23 people were interested in farming, and 7 in construction. As expected, more locals chose the job they were most familiar with. Lark decided that the farmers would help solve the problem of a shortage of construction labor during the winter season. At the very least, they could help move rocks and wood. 15 men were interested in becoming soldiers. The remaining 3 locals chose not to take any jobs. Lark thought that perhaps his reputation was a deterrent. The offers themselves were generous enough for this small town. Lark clapped his hands, and all attention turned to him. "I want all the farmers and builders to meet in this room tomorrow at this time," Lark said. "We will begin building the eastern border immediately." Those who belonged to the farmers and builders nodded their heads and replied, "I see, young master." Lark turned to the group of men to his left. Because they were homeless and a black famine had struck the kingdom, they were thin and weak. If it were not for the free gruel he was handing out, they would have been even thinner. "Now for the soldiers I will conduct a simple test," said Lark. He beckoned to the servants, and clay pots were handed out to each of the potential soldiers. "If you pass the test, I will allow you to join the ranks of my personal army. You will, of course, be given all benefits. You have my word. If you don't pass the test, don't worry, you can still choose to work as a farmer or a builder." Lark ordered the novice soldiers into formation. After receiving the pots, each of them received 3 seeds. Asking for the name of the man in front of him, Lark wrote something down on parchment. To Melody's surprise, Lark also asked her to participate in his test. The girl got in line and received her pot and seeds as well. After everyone received the seeds, Lark smiled. "Now for the dough. All of you will be instructed to grow these seeds. Make them grow in 4 days." The budding soldiers were stunned and confused. They wanted to be soldiers, not farmers. Why did the young master ask them to grow some seeds? As if voicing everyone's thoughts, one of the men asked, "Forgive my impertinence, but is this little ordeal really necessary?" We're not farmers." Lark was expecting this question. He nodded. Sure. Look, if you can't make these 3 seeds sprout, you will fail the test. Only those who successfully make all 3 seeds grow into a small plant in a specified period of time will be able to join my personal army. He looked at Melody and said, "The same goes for you." The girl nodded, showing that she understood. Lark cleared his throat. Any questions? After a short silence, he said, "Farmers and builders, you must gather here tomorrow. As for the soldiers, come back in 4 days. Bring your plants with you." With these words he escorted them out of the hall. Lark licked his lips and smiled. He looked forward to the results in 4 days. Evander knew he was dreaming as he watched the scene before his eyes. A boy, about 5 or 6 years old, was poking around in the garden. His silver hair was a mess, and his azure eyes smiled. Droplets of sweat ran down his face as he laughed. Butterflies flew around, birds chirped. It would have been a peaceful, pristine scene if not for the cat in front of him. The cat was mutilated. Its ears had been cut off, and its skin was charred in many places. Blood dripped from its open mouth. Judging by its faint meowing, the cat was barely alive. "Mr. Cat, I asked you to play with me, didn't I?" said the boy. "You should have listened to me. This is your punishment." "That's right. Punishment." The boy continued to dig, his small hands scooping up the earth. As he put the cat in the hole, a young man ran up to him. The young man grabbed the boy by the collar and lifted him up. "Lark! What are you doing? Didn't I tell you to stop killing pets?" "Big brother," said the boy, tilting his head. "What are you talking about?" "I'm just playing with the cat." The boy smiled, and Evander's dream ended. When Evander awoke, he sat up slowly in his bed. If he had known the dream would be unpleasant, he would have cut it short at the beginning. He realized that the dream was part of a memory of his current body. However, he had never encountered another person's body being taken over before, so he wasn't sure. "That's right, I'm Lark Marcus now," he said with a sigh. He went to the window and threw back the curtains. The snow continued to fall. After the job offer was announced, he supervised a construction project on the city's eastern border. To his surprise, the workers did not complain at all. Fortunately, there was wood nearby, so there was no shortage of wood. The bad weather left some materials untouched, but with the help of heat stones, the workers were able to start building. According to Lark, since these homes will eventually be turned over to local residents, they will have an incentive to work on them. In addition, the heat stones had a big impact on the environment. Although each stone could not completely eliminate the snow and cold, it allowed workers to continue building despite the weather. 4 days had passed since the recruitment, and it was time to evaluate the soldiers. Carrot was depressed. Today was the deadline for the young master's test to become a soldier. He had done his best, but only one of the 3 seeds had sprouted. He stared at the plant in the pot. It was small, inconspicuous, but the only successful one of the 3. "I'm definitely going to fail the test. Maybe I'd better become a farmer." The north and west lands are barren, but the young gentleman said he had a way to use the land. Being a farmer was not a bad idea. He could plow his fields and enjoy his crops. Unlike other parts of the kingdom where battles were often fought, Blackstone was a relatively peaceful area. There were very few instances where armies or bandits plundered the town. Being a farmer in this region was definitely safer than in other parts of the kingdom. "But I can't even grow a damn seed," he scolded himself. "I guess I'm not cut out to be a farmer. Being a builder is my only choice." Frankly, he wanted the benefit of being a soldier. 11 pieces of silver was a huge stipend. He was also tempted by the offer of free meat. Although a soldier's job involved risking his life, this was Blackstone, almost no one visited it. Even merchants only occasionally stopped by, since they had nothing to offer. Were it not for the Lion City, 2 days away, this town would have been isolated from the rest of the kingdom. Carrot ran his fingers through his ruffled black hair in frustration. He really wanted to be a soldier, but the result of his test was obvious. He stared again at the only plant growing in his pot. He had lived in this town for 2 decades. He was sure the plant was a cull shrub. It was a common plant that could grow everywhere. Although it was not as common as poison cloud, it was still quite easy to find. An idea popped into Carrot's head. Since these 3 seeds are the same, if I just find a cull bush on the ground, a small one, and then plant it in a pot, surely the young master won't notice the difference, right? If he succeeds in doing this, he will definitely pass the test. Eventually, he will be able to meet the requirement of having 3 plants growing in the pot. Carrot stood motionless inside the ruined hut. The roof had fallen under the weight of the accumulated snow. Immersed in his thoughts, he paid no attention to the falling snow around him. After a while, Carrot sighed. Steam came out of his mouth. Forget it. I'll feel bad if I pass the test that way. If I can't become a soldier or a farmer, I can still qualify as a construction worker. The young master promised. Strengthening his resolve, Carrot wrapped his body in a thin blanket, took the pot, and went to the mansion. Along the way he noticed some of the novice warriors carrying their pots. They held them as if the pot were something precious, as if their lives depended on it. To Carrot's horror, he saw that there were 3 cull bushes growing in some of the pots. All 3 seeds sprouted. Damnation! He gritted his teeth and tried to suppress the bitterness in his heart. Upon arrival at the mansion, the would-be soldiers gathered again in the hall. The young master was already there, with the old butler standing beside him. Lark counted them and nodded. Good. I think we're all here. So, how did it go? Did you enjoy my little ordeal? The lord was young, probably about 15 or 16, but Carrot wondered why the boy's gaze was so full and deep, as if it contained wisdom accumulated over decades of life. It was a stark contrast to the young gentleman he had met a few months before. The playful and arrogant Lark Marcus had completely disappeared. The novice warriors merely nodded at the young lord's remark. Lark grinned and spread his hands. Then let's start the evaluation. The butler told everyone to stand in line, and the young gentleman took a large sheet of parchment. The first in line was a tall man with prominent cheekbones. He radiated confidence as he held the pot. Inside the clay pot grew 3 bushes of cal. Before the man could even speak, the young gentleman said, "Fail." Next. Carrot was puzzled. The man had successfully grown 3 plants. So why did he fail? It was a question that kept him busy, and Carrot was sure the same question was on everyone's mind. The man swallowed a lump in his throat and looked at the pot he was holding. "Young master, what does failure mean?" The young gentleman narrowed his eyes. "Didn't you hear me? I said you failed the test." "But I grew all 3 seeds. Look." The man raised the pot so that the young master could see it more clearly. "That's the thing," said the young gentleman. "One of these seeds is defective, dead, unable to grow. And yet you grew 3 of them. You obviously cheated, and I will not tolerate cheaters in my personal army." The man froze. Carrot noticed that those who had grown the 3 plants were troubled. Slowly, hope began to build in Carrot's heart. The young master said that one of the seeds was defective. Then perhaps the reason is that my other seeds didn't sprout. Soon Carrot's excitement swept over him. After all, a soldier's job might be well within his reach. "Look, what's the most important aspect of being a soldier?" Lark asked. Everyone fell silent. Strength? Endurance? Wealth? No. It's reliability. The rest is secondary. A soldier is not just a killing machine, it is not a creature meant to subjugate another. A soldier is one who ensures the safety of the sovereign. If the core is rotten, the body will be rotten. There was a warmth in Carrot's chest. He felt his heart begin to pound loudly. The most important thing is not strength. It is reliability. The rest is secondary. These words kept ringing in Carrot's head. We can train our bodies. We can train our skills. We can train our spirit, Lark said. But we can't train our character. That's the purpose of this challenge. One by one the young lord judged the novice warriors. Soon it was Carrot's turn. The hair on his arms stood on end as he stood before the young lord. He was nervous. He was simply eager to pass the test. When I pass my exam, I could eat meat every 4 days. It would be heaven. For a commoner like him, meat was a luxury he could only dream of. Unless a neighbor's hunter shared his catch, Carrot could not eat meat at all. The mere idea of free meat made him salivate. Name? Lark asked. In a trembling voice Carrot answered, K-Carrot. Lark looked at the pot Carrot was holding, then at the parchment. He smiled and touched Carrot's shoulder. You passed the exam. Congratulations. Upon hearing this, Carrot could barely suppress his joy. He bowed his head. Thank you, young master. The young lord only grinned. The soldier's training will be harsh. Be prepared. Yes. I'll do my best. After the evaluation, out of 15 people, only 9 passed the exam. Lark clapped his hands. I'll skip the formalities. As of today, we will begin your training.